Good afternoon. I'd like to congratulate the Middle East Institute and Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain and the staff for organizing such an outstanding conference. It's really been fabulous. I'd like to make 4 broad points about the Arab dimension of the regional system. And I'll talk about it both at the level of the public and public opinion and at the level of governments and the strategic calculations as I see them today. Let me start first with the huge gap between government positions and public opinion on major strategic issues of the day. That's quite obvious on the Arab-Israeli issue, on the Iran issue, on the Turkey issue, and on the US issue. Let me start with the obvious. For Arab states, particularly those in the Gulf region, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the United Arab Emirates or Kuwait or Oman or any of the Gulf states, and certainly for Egypt and Jordan and Morocco, the US is an indispensable ally, and in some instances, really a state that helps them achieve their security, particularly after the decline of Iraqi power. If you look at Arab public opinion, and in the 6 states in which I poll with Zogby International, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan, when you ask people, name the 2 countries that are most threatening to you personally, roughly 90%, pretty much year after year, identify Israel first. Roughly 80% identify the United States second. And roughly about 10% identify Iran third. And so when you look at the priorities of public perception of how they view the threats, particularly the choices that the US is putting on the table, that is different from the calculations of most Arab governments. And that trend, by the way, varies a little bit. The Iranian threat is a little bit higher in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but it's still in 3rd place. And that is remarkable, including in countries that are neighboring. And I think sometimes people misunderstand, in some ways, the sentiment on Iran. It's not that there is a love for Iran in the Arab world. It is clear that Iran is seen in the Arab world as the enemy of my enemy. And when there's anger with Israel and with the US, there's more sympathy with Iran. So in this year, for example, in the polling, for the first time, a slight majority of those we polled in the 6 countries think the Middle East would actually be a better place if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons. That's quite a dramatic position to take, given where the government's positions are. This also is reflected in the worldview that the Arab public has. When you ask them in an open question, name the leader that you admire most in the world, name whoever you want, outside your own country. I don't put them in a position to choose their own leaders. And, you know, invariably, over the past, since we started doing this almost a decade, sitting Arab leaders are not among the heroes. And typically, this year, the #1 leader who's most admired is the Prime Minister of Turkey. The #2 leader who's admired is Hugo Chavez. The #3 leader who's admired is the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. The #4 leader who's admired is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran. Now, these, by the way, don't get huge numbers. We're talking about the top vote getter gets about 20%. It's just they can name anyone they want in the world. But still, if you look at the ranking, it gives you the mindset. It's exactly the opposite of the leaders who would be selected by Arab governments. And so there is undoubtedly when we say, quote, Arabs want to join in a coalition against Iran, or quote, Arab wants to see war in Iraq, first of all, keep in mind, people are talking about governments. They're not talking about the public, because the public is of different minds. Yes, it varies from country to country, but not as much as you might think. By and large, this is the public sentiment. Second, on the public level, there is no avoiding the fact that the Arab public looks at the world, including at Iran and Turkey, including at Latin America, including at the United States, including at the rest of the world, through the prism of the Arab-Israeli issue. And if you look at the polling that we have, every single question that we ask, including the heroes that I just put on the table, are heroes not because people embrace them or they even in some cases know a lot about them, like in the case of Hugo Chavez, but they know that they have taken a position that they like on the Arab-Israeli issue. This is the judgment that they have passed throughout the past decade. Iraq matters too, by the way, and I'll come back to that. And we see it also in the poll this year in terms of attitudes toward President Barack Obama. Now, I know we had this theory last year that it's all about attitudes toward, quote, the Muslim world. And let's change the rhetoric and be nice to the Muslim world. And yes, the Cairo speech transformed reality. Well, I think that was an inaccurate understanding of where the Arab public is. And one way to understand how this was a misconception is to understand that even before the Cairo speech, in the poll that we conducted in April and May of 2009, you had a plurality of Arab for the first time having a favorable view of the American president, and only a small minority having a negative view of the American president. That's really nothing, we found nothing like it in previous years. More than 50% were now, that is then, optimistic about American policy in the Middle East before the Cairo speech. And the Cairo speech may have helped a little bit, but this was not the basis of the shift that had taken place before. This year, when we poll among the same publics, we find that the overwhelming majority has an unfavorable view of President Obama. Those who have a favorable view of the president are less than 20%. The overwhelming majority of Arabs are pessimistic about American policy in the Middle East. So when you ask them, so why are you passing that judgment, especially given what the president said about Islam and Muslims and the Cairo speech? They do say that of all the policies in the past year that of the Obama administration toward the Middle East, they like the most his new attitudes toward the Muslim world. They acknowledge that. But when you ask them what explains the change of views about the administration, 61% say the Arab-Israeli issue, and another 30% say the Iraq war. Very few people, by the way, say democracy or economic aid or any of that sort. Basically, those are the issues that they identify. Over and over again, we find that people pass judgment through this prism, the prism of the Arab-Israeli issue, and that was certainly true, and I think it was a misunderstanding about the Cairo speech as well. People thought maybe there was something about people accepting who the president was or expecting more about him personally. We don't find any evidence of that. It was that they heard a different rhetoric from him when he came to office, particularly his being prepared to pull out of Iraq and highlighting the Arab-Israeli peacemaking, and they were hopeful about those two issues more than any other. And when in their view, the administration didn't deliver, their expectations were high, and they were raised by the Cairo speech, no doubt, attitudes changed dramatically. It's true that Arab governments still today have the capacity to ignore public opinion. They have done that over the decades, and they've done it as recently as over the Iraq war and the Gaza war and the Lebanon war. So in many ways, you have to ask the question, so why does it matter? I mean, we have been asking governments to do things that the public didn't support. The 2003 war, 90% of Arabs opposed the Iraq war. And then we asked governments to support us, and they did, including hosting our bases in the region to conduct attacks on Iraqi soil. So why couldn't this happen again? I think it could. I'm a realist about that. I think Arab governments have the capacity. But let's have no illusion. What happens when you do that? Two things. One is you force them to be even more repressive than they are before. How are they going to go against passionate public opinion on the issues that matter most and expect them to allow freedom of speech and opposition to their policies? That doesn't happen. That's why I think there's been less freedom since the Iraq War in 2003, despite what we have said or the kind of experiments that we have done, precisely because of that. The second is obviously it pushes people to the basement. And I think the question, one of the dangers that we now have is for groups like Al-Qaeda and its affiliates to take foothold in parts of the Arab world as they have in Yemen, and whether or not they'll exploit openings somewhere else, that remains to be seen. But it does come at a cost, but it's possible.